Rulings that the Supreme Court will issue in the coming years will decide the survival of our Second Amendment, our religious liberty, our public safety, and so much more. To maintain security, liberty, and prosperity, we must preserve our priceless heritage of a nation of laws, and there is no one better to do that than Amy Coney Barrett.
There's a lot of people who believe that right now. That was President Trump announcing Amy Coney Barrett as the Supreme Court nominee back in 2020. As our next guest writes in the New York Times, Trump appointed Barrett to clinch a 50-year conservative legal revolution, but now Justice Barrett is showing signs of a leftward drift. She has become the Republican-appointed justice most likely to be in the majority in decisions that reach a liberal outcome. Along with the Chief Justice, a frequent voting partner, Justice Barrett could be one of the few people in the country to check the actions of the president. New York Times reporter Jodi Kantor joins us now. Her new piece is titled How Amy Coney Barrett is Confounding the Right and the Left. And Jodi, thank you so much for being with us. This is an absolutely fascinating piece, and she is one of the most fascinating figures in Washington, D.C. And let's talk about what this is and what this is not. Right? This is not Amy Coney Barrett going the direction of, let's say, Justice Brennan or Justice Souter, so much as it is Amy Coney Barrett ruling more like John Roberts at times when she's just refusing to follow the hard right direction, ideological hard right direction of, say, Alito and Thomas, and instead is a law professor saying, how do I play the law?
One of the most fascinating things we were able to determine is that even though the data is limited, we can see that she is the Republican appointee on the court who has voted the most against President Trump. So that's one of the real signs of independence we're seeing. And to be clear, this is a very conservative justice. As you know, she voted to overturn Roe v. Wade. She voted to expand Second Amendment rights. She is a classic conservative in many, many ways, and yet an independent one.
Yeah, I mean, and that's such an important point. No one should expect her to move on abortion or on guns or on other key issues, on positions that she and other people in Federalist Society have held for 20, 30 years. But where you're talking about the use of presidential power, where you're talking about these areas where Donald Trump is pushing the boundaries of Article 2 powers, she will be someone, as you've written, she will be somebody that will look at those questions hard and not just go along with what the president or what the most conservative base on the court wants her to go.
One of the most surprising things I heard throughout the reporting of this piece is that she's kind of alone on the Supreme Court. You know, when President Trump chose her, the right and the left sort of both acted very sure of who she was, and that's turned out not to be true. If you look at her on the court, she is really one of the only ones from outside of Washington, D.C. She never held one of these big executive branch jobs that shaped the others. Being a law professor sounds like a somewhat traditional background for a Supreme Court justice, but it is a different way of thinking about the law. She is the youngest justice. She is the least experienced judge. She's the only mother of grade school age children to serve on the court. And there's this quality of apartness that she has in her decisions. She will often sign on to the general direction of a conservative decision, but write a separate concurrence telling her male colleagues, you're doing it wrong. One line that made me laugh is that somebody from the court said to me, Jodi, she's the Hermione Granger of the conservative supermajority. She's always telling the men they're doing it wrong.
Yeah, and two examples of that really stood out for me at the end of the last term where I go, okay, wait a second. She's not going to just sort of blindly follow where some of her more conservative male colleagues go. One was when she sort of chastised Clarence Thomas at one point and said, hey, listen, you can't just pick something that happened in 1650 and say it applies to the law in America, today. But another was in the much talked about immunity ruling, where she agreed with Justice Sotomayor on one portion of it, which was a very important portion, where she said that you actually can look at official acts as evidence if a president is being persecuted for unofficial acts, and said you can't blind juries. That was very significant sort of departure from the conservative majority.
Well, I think she thinks about the law in a way that is really in contrast to sort of conventional political views. Like, some people were very surprised that she kind of checked Justice Thomas's view of originalism. She essentially said to him in several opinions, "You're going too far, you're using history wrong." And that really surprised some people over the last year or two. But if you look back at her really old classroom lectures and the things she said when she was still in the relative privacy of the Notre Dame classroom, she would say, "I'm an originalist and I'm a textualist, and part of the way we protect this kind of thinking is that we acknowledge its flaws, we acknowledge its limitations, we acknowledge when it's going too far." So I garnered from that she is a very deep believer in this way of thinking,
right,
but thinks that there's kind of like a protective function to limiting it, which, as you know, is totally opposite from a kind of political thinking.
Right, and Jonathan Lemire kind of reminds me of someone who she knew very well, and that is Justice Scalia, who, of course, had no problem staring down the far-right squealers if he was talking about a First Amendment right to burn an American flag, or if he was talking about the right to due process that people that were in America illegally had a right to do. Time and again, Justice Scalia did what he believed was most rooted to the law. And I believe he was the one that Jody quoted, who said, if you're not uncomfortable with some of the rulings that you put out there, you're doing it wrong, because it just means that you're reading the law the way that it makes you feel good, instead of reading the law as it is.
He also said, "I'm an originalist, but I'm not a nut."
Yeah, no, that's right. And both justices here, willing to show an independence, apolitical thinking. And the Scalia quote is great. But one person who at times has expressed unhappiness with her independent thinking is President Trump, who has made it clear that he believes that Supreme Court justices that he nominated should sort of be rubber stamps for what he believes is his agenda. So talk to us a little bit more about that backlash from Trump and his MAGA supporters.
So President Trump has complained about her in private. He's complained in public about the other justices he appointed as well. Now, interestingly, we also say in the story that these concerns were brought to him when she was first under consideration, and he waved them away. Remember that they were trying to appoint somebody very fast. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was dying. There was a presidential election 6 weeks away. So they were trying to choose a nominee they thought would be really palatable. What is remarkable, and I know you've covered this on the show, is that the fury and wrath that MAGA has shown to Justice Barrett is remarkable. Now she gets pressure and threats and criticism and nastiness from both sides. This is a hard time to be a Supreme Court justice. One thing people at the court talk about privately that they, I think, talk about less publicly is that the job has degraded somewhat, right? The security concerns, the level of ferocity and pressure. And what we see this spring is that she, like many other federal judges, has been subject to an extraordinary assault. It's interesting appearing right after the Minnesota discussion on this show, because there's a relationship to those two things, right? We see that federal judges are being targeted in some of the same terrifying ways. We actually got the text from a police report of a bomb threat directed not at Justice Barrett, but at her sister, at her relatives. And that's the new tactic, to fan out to judges' relatives.
It is deeply dispiriting and terrifying. the rise in political violent rhetoric. It's something everyone should be stopping. New York Times reporter Jodi Kantor, thank you so much. It's a great piece. We really appreciate it. It is available to read online now.